So let's talk a little bit more about crime. We'll start with the problems with measuring crime rates. There are three different types of data that I want to talk about. One would be victimization data, one would be arrest data, and another one would be conviction data. In victimization data, we survey the general public, generally through a random sample, and we ask people, in the past month, have you been a victim of a crime? In the past year, have you been the victim of a crime? And people will report to us whether or not they have been a crime victim. That is the best measurement we have for sort of grasping the overall crime rates in society. That said, there are still people who might lie, right? Like, for example, if your spouse is abusing you, you might not want to say that in front of your spouse. Sometimes people might even forget that they were a crime victim, like, oh, by the way, back in January, someone did steal something from my car. So that data, while it's incomplete, it's probably the best one we have. The other two types of data are arrest data and conviction data. And those are both problematic data that don't give us an overall sense of what's going on in the population because, one, not everybody's arrested for a crime, right? There are crimes that are committed and no one is arrested. And then if we take it a step further, no one is convicted if they're not arrested, right? So conviction data is going to be the smallest subset. Those are people who are arrested and subsequently convicted, right? Whereas this overall victimization data is just doing a random sample of the culture and trying to get a sense of that. There's probably underreporting in victimization data. There are problems with arrest data as well. There may be biases in who gets arrested, especially based on things like class and race. And the same with convictions. Just because someone is not convicted does not mean they didn't engage in the crime. A lot of people feel that way about O.J. Simpson. They feel like he did kill his wife, but he didn't go to jail for that. And there are other people who have probably committed crimes as well who have not been convicted. Maybe they didn't have enough evidence to convict the person. Maybe the witnesses didn't want to cooperate in the trial. There's a lot of pressure on police and prosecutors to arrest people and to get convictions, but that causes some problems in the criminal justice system, right? Sometimes we see people who are arrested and subsequently we find out later through DNA or other witnesses come forward that that person wasn't actually guilty of the crime. So the political pressure is very strong to arrest and convict people. And sometimes people, understandably are so upset about certain crimes that they're not always willing to allow the justice process to follow through, especially if it's an egregious crime, like a crime against a child or an innocent elderly person or something like that. I want to revisit the issue of inequalities. However, briefly, I talked about inequalities when we talked about the conflict view of crime. Inequalities can also cover things like social class. In particular, I want to talk about white-collar crime versus street crime. White-collar crime is crimes of the elite. So it might be like well-connected politicians. Several people close to Donald Trump, such as Michael Cohen, for example, or Paul Manafort. They have been convicted of these crimes that are white-collar crimes. They've lied about tax forms or moved money around to locations without the proper following the proper procedures. I don't actually remember everything they were convicted of. So then the other types of criminals are going to be street criminals. So street crime is everyday crime. If someone robs a liquor store, if someone assaults their neighbor, these are crimes sort of everyday people. What's important for sociologists is that they're not really treated the same, right? Wealthy people's crimes, white-collar crimes often go unpunished or punished very minimally, whereas street crimes tend to be punished much more harshly. The other thing that comes up as well in the system when we talk about class and crime is not everybody can afford the same quality representation, right? If you have money, you can hire a very good lawyer. And you can pay that lawyer, the $400, $500, $600 an hour it's going to cost you to be represented by this person. If you don't have that kind of money, you're going to be stuck with a public defender, and a public defender has 40, 50 other people they're dealing with. They can't devote as much time to you. You are not going to get the same quality representation. And so a lot of times the amount of punishment or the rate of conviction is very heavily influenced by your economic standing and also by your race. So we see race and class kind of working together here. Some people believe that we should get rid of bail entirely. Bail is money that is given to get you out of jail. Let me back up. When you get arrested for a crime, they take you to jail first. So jail is like at your local county, city level. You go into the jail. If your crime is very minor, they will release you and you might not even have bail. But if your crime's a little bit more serious, you may have some sort of bail. More serious could mean things like, fleeing the scene of a car accident even. It's not just very, very minor things. So bail allows you to get out of jail while you are awaiting trial. Then if you are convicted at your trial and they say, you've been convicted of, robbery or possession of a stolen vehicle or something like that, then they will send you on to prison unless you have like a very, very short sentence, and they might let you finish that up at the jail. But prison is for people who are going to be there a lot longer, all of whom have been convicted of their crimes, whereas jail has many people who haven't even been convicted of a crime. Well, if people are poor, they often can't afford bail money. They can't afford the money to get out. And so some states now have decided to try to engage in some reforms that allow people to not be charged bail so that they can be out while they're awaiting their trial. Now, that has an upside and a downside. I mean, it is unfair that very wealthy people who've engaged in very bad behaviors can get bail even when their bond is like $100,000. They can easily come up with $10,000. Where there are poor people who sit in prison for months on end for, something much less serious. And so some people feel like the system is very biased in that regard. However, if you do away with bail entirely, the other worry is that there might be some people who did something pretty bad and they end up back out on the street. Although some people would come back and say, well, if they're that bad, the judge should just deny them any bail, period. And so you see a big debate about how we're going to handle that, but a lot of how that ends up being handled will be handled because of this class difference. This is why it's coming up, I should say. Racism is also very intricately tied to this. Who gets representation? Who really gets a jury of their peers? How often do we see racial profiling, racial stereotyping? You'll see these cases. One of the famous ones is of Brock Turner, the Stanford swimmer who gets convicted of rape, and he's a very wealthy white kid going to I think Stanford, not Princeton, I can't remember now. He's going to an Ivy League school, and he gets 3 months in prison for raping a woman. And it was a very serious rape. She was unconscious. 2 guys found him behind a dumpster, I think, sexually assaulting this young woman who was passed out. And he got 3 months. The judge said he was worried that might ruin his life. How often does that happen for a poor kid who grew up in my neighborhood in Southern Ohio, or a poor Latino kid in Houston, Texas, or a poor black kid in New York City? Like, do they get those kind of chances? And not that we might want people to get those kind of chances. Maybe if people rape people, we want them to go to jail longer than 3 months. However, what we're seeing is there's a huge gap, right? Wealthier people, whiter people are committing these crimes and generally not getting punished in the same way that poorer people and people of color are being punished. And so that's a huge issue. Victimless crimes are also called crimes of moral order. That includes things like prostitution, illegal gambling, and selling drugs. These are crimes where you're not trying to directly harm someone. You're not raping them or assaulting them or robbing them. You are engaging in this criminal activity together. I got the weed and you want to buy it. I've got the heroin and you want to shoot it up. And we come together and I agree to sell it to you and you agree to buy it. That would be an example of a victimless crime. In many places, these things are legal. And there has been a trend toward legalization. Legalization of drugs, legalization of prostitution. For example, in Germany, prostitution is legal. It is regulated. You can only have clients at these brothels when they make the prostitutes get tested. They make the johns you have like security guards and all these other things so that the prostitutes are not being harmed by these people. A lot of people think none of these things should be illegal. Gambling is a great example of something that used to be illegal, and now you can go to a casino on any corner. So our cultural attitude has changed, and that's sort of why we call these crimes of moral order, right? Some people feel like it's trying to enforce a certain code of morality. So for example, I personally, you don't have to agree with me, I personally believe prostitution should be legal. Do I think it's great to run around and say, I need $50 to make you holler? No, not exactly. However, I don't think you're going to very easily stop that behavior. And so I believe, and many other proponents of both legalizing prostitution, sex work, and drugs would argue that if you make these things legalized, you can create a better system to protect the people who are engaging in the behavior, whether it's protecting them from sexually transmitted infections, protecting them from overdosing. So in some countries, they've legalized drugs and they regulate them and the state sells them and you can only use them in certain locations. Now, some people would say, well, that's encouraging that behavior. It may make some people want to try it a little more, but I think for the most part, people are already doing this. I mean, clearly making it illegal didn't stop people from engaging in prostitution or using drugs. That hasn't worked. So I think it's very important for us to be practical. And I'm not saying that certain moral values, we shouldn't have them in our society, but we also have to be practical. Just because we pass a law and make something illegal does not mean it's not going to happen, right? Have a really hard time getting rid of prostitution. That's what the world's oldest profession. Another thing to think about is property crime versus violent crime. Property crimes are where you're harming people, where you're harming things. Fix that. And violent crimes are crimes where you're harming people. So for example, a property crime is stealing somebody's car or vandalizing their house or something like that. A violent crime is something like rape, robbery, murder, assault. Those are violent crimes. You're doing harm to people. The good news is that both of those have declined dramatically since the 90s. We had a real crime wave in the 70s to the 80s and early 90s. And from about 93, 94, we have seen all of these forms of crime drop. So you all have come of age in a low crime era. Now, that said, if we see a huge uptick in unemployment, we may see a rapid increase in the crime rate. It's hard to know how this coronavirus will affect things long term. In the short term, the crime rate is down. Now, are people just not calling the police? That's possible, but I actually think because they're not out running the streets as much, they're not engaging in quite as much crime. Organized crime is another issue when we think about groups like the mafia, even MS-13 to some extent is an organized crime group. These groups are very hard to regulate. They tend to have a very rigid structure. They operate in many ways like businesses operate. Motorcycle gangs would be another example of that. But the challenge with organized crime is because they're so well organized and they're often delivering things that people want. They're just doing it outside of the law. For example, delivering drugs, or in some states they infiltrated unions and started ripping off the local trash hauling companies, telling them you have to pay for protection or we're going to shoot you or, whatever, beat you up or whatever. I don't know, do something bad. That has been an insidious problem that the U.S. has had to work a lot on over the past 40, 50 years. We created laws about racketeering. A lot of times the bosses of these crime syndicates don't actually engage in the behavior themselves. They have their underlings do it. So the problem is when they have these poor people who are willing to, do all these things to try to work their way up, it used to be that you couldn't really punish these bosses, right? And so they created these racketeering laws to try to stop those people and to allow them to also be punished because they're the ones ordering these hits on people or they're the ones directing a lot of the criminal behavior. Some people think that the criminal justice system is really overburdened, and I think that's another huge social problem. If we didn't have people taking plea bargains, in a plea bargain, you don't actually go to trial. Your lawyer, if you have one, and the prosecutor and the judge, you all will come to an agreement. Usually the lawyer and the prosecutor get together first, and then they bring it to the judge. yeah, we don't want to go through a trial. We will plead to a lesser charge. So maybe you're charged with, I'll give you a real life example. I know someone who was charged with second-degree murder, and this person had shot and killed someone who was stealing from their home. And the prosecutor, from my perception, felt that no one was really going to convict this guy, particularly in that neighborhood, of murder. It felt like if the person's stealing from his home, people are going to be sympathetic to him. Keep in mind, the person wasn't in his home when he was shot. He was leaving the home, and hence the charge. So they ended up downgrading it and making a plea bargain for manslaughter, which is a much shorter sentence. And that guy, I think he was sentenced to like 10 years, but he got out after 4 for good behavior. And he had no prior criminal history or anything like that. That's an example of a plea bargain. You don't have to go to trial. They allow you to come together and agree that you're going to plead to some charge. If we didn't have that, our criminal justice system would come to a grinding halt, because the truth is we don't have enough public defenders. We don't have enough judges for every single case to go to trial. So you see a lot of plea bargaining. You see public defenders having, 30, 40 clients at a time. In Louisiana, I heard a story about them driving all over the state to see their clients, in other parishes. It's a mess. So the criminal justice system is really not operating optimally, and that's why a lot of reforms have been proposed. And these are Democrats and Republicans proposing many of these changes. Another thing you see is these mandatory minimum sentences. That used to be a big problem we had, and a lot of people are now moving away from that. They think, some of these sentences are too harsh. A lot of the police are also overburdened. One of the areas where I kind of empathize with the police, even though I get frustrated because I do think racial profiling is a big problem, the police are being asked to do a lot of things that they're not really trained to do. So, for example, one idea has been, maybe we need to train more social workers. Maybe we need social workers who are with the police to help resolve some of these neighborhood disputes or things like that. So I worry that, the police are sometimes doing the wrong thing, not because they're trying to do the wrong thing, but because they're not trained to deal with some of the situations that they are encountering. And, you see cases, like I remember one of a woman who got arrested while she was on a job interview because she left her 2 kids in the car for like 20 minutes. And, the poor woman, she's a single mom, unemployed, and she leaves her kid in the car, which isn't the greatest decision ever. But, they end up charging her with like 1st-degree felony child endangerment or something. And a lot of people were like, isn't that an overreach? And so a lot of people feel, the whole system is it's going too far, whether it's the prosecutors or the police, they're not really promoting the best kind of justice. And then things are turning into legal problems that used to be solved between people. Just to give you an example, kids fighting each other at a high school. When I was a kid, you never called the police for that. Someone would have to be hurt really, really bad for that to happen. And now what we're seeing is police actually in the school. Huge change from the past.